Chapter 14. Sam pressed himself back against the wall of the cabin and watched Clarence Adams swing into the saddle. He was lucky that he had been able to shut Ezra up back in the cabin to keep Clarence from finding out that his conversation with Jeff Kadri had been overheard by the two Powder Valley men. The young man must be congratulating himself on having pulled the wool over everyone's eyes. That's what Sam thought. It was a nice setup, him being a deputy sheriff and also a member of the Lacy gang. That was what he meant by careful planning and putting members of the gang in key positions before the shooting started. No wonder the Lacy gang could clean up whole communities and escape unscathed if they had the law all sewed up beforehand. Clarence Adams was hesitating, glancing back towards the cabin to assure himself that he wasn't being watched, and Sam remained frozen against the log wall, and it was impossible for Clarence to see him. Apparently satisfied that his story had been accepted and that he had been permitted to ride away unobserved, the deputy wheeled his horse away. Sam couldn't repress a start of astonishment when he saw the direction Clarence was taking. He was heading up the canyon instead of down the back trail, directly towards that blank wall of solid rock that blocked the canyon not more than 100 feet away. Sam held his position against the wall, not daring to move because he figured Clarence was just making a feint in that direction and then would immediately ride back to see if he was being watched. Sam kept his eyes glued on the shadowy figure of the horse and rider as they approached the blank wall. It was that period of intense darkness that was always preceding the first light of dawn, and as Clarence rode further away it became more and more difficult for Sam's night-seeing eyes to distinguish him from the black backdrop of rock towards which he rode. But Sam waited quietly, refusing to be drawn off guard. Clarence would have to ride back, and that would be time enough to start following him then. Sam blinked his eyes and strained to see through the enveloping darkness. He thought he saw Clarence, and then abruptly he didn't. He waited for him to reappear, tensed against the wall. He continued to wait, and could still see nothing. The sound of horses' hooves against rocks had stopped also. It seemed to Sam that the ghostly echo of hoofbeats still lingered in the oppressive silence, but that too was fading away. He continued to wait, growing more nervous as each second slid by. What was the young deputy up to? Had he dismounted up there after fading from sight? Was he planning on slipping back and making a desperate one-man attempt to rescue the members of the gang from their captors? Sam still wasn't quite positive of Clarence's position in the deal. It was evident that Harry and the other outlaws didn't recognize him as one of them. Still, it wasn't likely that Clarence was a regular member. He had probably been roped in by Lacy just for this one job. That would explain why the others didn't recognize him, but why had Clarence let them carry off the girl if he was in love with her? Why hadn't he revealed his identity as one of them on the road that was going to Santa Alicia when they rescued Pat, thinking he was a local Confederate? Sam's racing thoughts found an answer for that question almost as soon as it came to his mind. The deputy had been caught plumb in the middle. He couldn't explain to the men in front of Helen without losing her respect and love. With her father just murdered by the gang, he couldn't let her know that he was one of them. But what was he up to now? Why didn't he come back afoot if that's what he had planned to do? Not a sound, no faint fragment of noise came from the blank wall of the upper canyon. It was as though the earth had swallowed up both horse and rider right before Sam's watchful eyes. Suddenly Sam began to swear softly to himself. That was just about by God what had happened. For he was recalling the explicit disappearance of Helen and Ben Andrews under similar circumstances. There must be some way out of Lonesome Creek by the way of the dead end, and he, like a gosh darn fool, had stood right there and let Clarence ride away without even trying to keep him in sight. Of all the gosh awful fools in the state of New Mexico, Sam Salone, was certainly the gosh darndest awfulest. He moved away from the cabin swiftly, bent almost to double to attract less attention, to pick up the tracks of Clarence's horse leading up the canyon. With uncanny skill, Sam found the set of tracks he sought and sorted them out from amongst the maze of other tracks and followed them with his nose close to the ground, almost like a bloodhound on a hot scent. In fact, Pat and Ezra had often in the past accused him of following a trail with his nose when he was accomplishing tracking miracles that wasn't human. Sam Sloane didn't deny the charge. In fact, he wasn't quite sure that his nose didn't help him in following such a trail. It was an instinctive process, and one which Sam himself couldn't explain. He simply knew he was on the right set of tracks, and he followed them unerringly in the darkness without knowing how he was able to do so. They led straight towards the solid rock wall. There were tracks of other horses, too, leading in the same direction. 2 other sets made not more than an hour before. Sam was bent far over and was trotting by the time he neared the rock. The 3 sets of tracks led straight ahead, seemingly vanished into the very face of the wall itself, under a low, weathered spruce tree that clung tenaciously to life with its roots sunk into a crevice at the very base of the wall. Sam pulled up short and stared in utter disbelief when he saw that the horse tracks disappeared round the tree, which appeared to cling so closely to the rock that not even a squirrel could squirm betwixt the 2. Sam took another step forward to the side of the spruce, and then planted his hands on his hips, and began cursing himself for a great deal of fluency and feelings. That's what a man got for taking anything for granted. He had walked right past that weathered old spruce not more than half an hour previously without looking behind it. Who the hell would have thought it concealed a cleft in the face of the cliff? A narrow passageway, not quite as high as the top of the tree, wide enough to admit a rider and high enough so that a tall man could ride into it without ducking his head, so perfectly hidden that even in broad daylight no man could possibly guess its presence without actually sticking his face round the spruce and looking in. Sam took a step forward into the dark entrance and stood there listening quietly. It seemed to him he could hear distant horse hoofbeats echoing back to him along the rocky corridor. All doubt was dispelled now. Helen Higgins and Ben Andrews had certainly ridden this way, and Clarence Adam had entered the passageway not more than 10 minutes before. Sam hesitated a moment over the knotty problem of whether to go back for his horse or to follow the deputy on foot. Pat's roan was dead, and that made them short 1 horse. Sam had no idea where the rock passage led, nor what he would find at the other end. The chances were pretty good that he'd be a long time returning from his dangerous assignment. He decided he'd better leave his horse for the use of his wounded compadre, and besides, he could follow much more silently on foot. The rock passage made sort of an echoey chamber that would warn anyone at the other end almost as soon as a horse entered it. Sam started forward into the utter darkness with both hands outstretched in front and slightly to each side, guiding him through the rocky corridor. From the feel of the rough rock walls, he was positive the rift was of natural origin, the spreading apart of 2 stratas under terrific pressure of an earth upheaval, leading upward at a steep angle from the bottom in a natural funnel that must have been there for centuries. The air was fresh and clean, with no dampness or musty odor, indicating that both ends were open so that air could circulate freely. Sam's heart was hammering loudly as he pushed himself forward at a slow trot along the steep incline. The width remained fairly constant, not deviating more than a foot either way from its 3-foot average. And then, suddenly, one of the walls angled up sharply away from the fingertips of his outstretched hand, and the angle of the ascent changed to a flat surface. Sam stopped a moment to catch his breath and decided which wall to follow. The one on his left led straight ahead, while the other to his right fell away sharply at a steep angle. He went ahead slowly, feeling his way along the left wall, and after about 20 feet he discovered that the other wall converged again to form the same sort of tunnel that he had been following from the bottom. Once again, Sam started on his upward climb. It was evidently a natural chamber formed by a freak of nature while the world was young and suffering from cooling pains, but Sam could not take time to explore it now. That would come later, after he had discovered where the thing came out at the top and just what Deputy Sheriff Clarence Adam was up to. It was an arduous climb before it ended, a good quarter of a mile from the bottom of the opening at the top. So that's what Sam figured. He climbed out of the rocky corridor suddenly and found himself at the head of a steep-walled ravine that dipped downward sharply from the brow of a low hill. The upper end was guarded by a cluster of thorn bushes which hid the entrance fairly well, though nothing quite as effective as the spruce at the other end. There was a faint glow of pink in the eastern sky when Sam emerged in the open air again. Not enough yet light to see the landscape, but a distinct forerunner of dawn. He climbed up out of the ravine to level ground and dropped down for a moment to catch his breath. A cluster of lights immediately below him, and not more than 200 yards distance, caught his eye at once. They were the lit windows of a lonely ranch house, where it was unusual for lights to be burning at this pre-dawn hour. Many ranchers made a practice of arising at daylight, but Sam knew none who got up before there was light enough to see what chores to do. He got up after a few minutes' rest and slowly made his way down the slope towards the lit ranch house. A group of saddle horses were ground tied in the yard not far from the front door, and Sam eased up to a lit window, stayed far back so he wouldn't be seen from inside. Dimity curtains were looped back at the bottom of the windows, leaving a small V through which he could see into the room. A girl sat on the far side of the room. He couldn't make out her features clearly, but he figured that she must be Helen Higgins. A tall figure was striding back and forth in front of her, talking and gesturing. Sam recognized him at once as the cadral individual named Nate Ledbetter and he and Ezra had encountered at the saloon. Sam couldn't see the other men in the room, but it was evident that a violent argument was raging inside. He moved around to another window, which enabled him to see young Ben Andrews sitting close to Helen. The young man had his rifle balanced across his knee, and his thin face was flushing angrily while he continually ran nervous fingers through the mop of his tawny hair. Clarence Adams stood across the room from Helen and Ben on widespread legs. He too appeared very angry, and each time the pacing Ledbetter ceased talking. Adams started. It was just as good watching a tent show, except that Sam couldn't hear what any of the actors were saying. Things quieted down almost at once. It appeared that Ledbetter and Adams had reached some sort of agreement. The girl looked frightened, and Ben Andrews stopped mussing with his hair to get both hands on his rifle, as though he was expecting to use it at any moment. Sam heard a rustle behind him, and whirled in time to see a loop and rope settle down about him. He drew his guns, but had time to fire only once into the half-darkness before the noose was drawn tight around him, fastening his arms to his body. And then, simultaneously, he was struck a stunning blow above his left ear, and his own shot was echoed by a rattling of explosions inside the house as he fell into a bottomless pit of darkness. End of chapter 14.